I'm delighted to be here and do this. This show was not my idea. This was completely the McMichaels creation, and to be called a guest curator is remarkable when being a guest curator here means Sarah phones you and says, hey, I got this painting, or I've just got this loan, and then you go, great, you know, and then she calls you again and you go, oh, we've just got this stuff from the War Museum, and you go, super, and then you show up and you talk about it. So this is a great gig. I got to do more of this. You know, it's easier than researching books. So to unpack a couple things, I just kind of freestyle a little bit as I go, but why Jackson's Wars and why the subtitle? Well, Jackson's Wars is plural because A.Y. Jackson fought a lot of wars. He had very strong opinions about art, about museums, about collectors in Canada, or non-collectors as the case may be, who didn't support Canadian artists. He scrapped with fellow artists, he scrapped with critics, and then he literally fought in a war. He scrapped with Germans. Interesting, I remembered today driving down that I was talking with my editor at McGill Queen's, you're always fighting over the title and the subtitle, and he goes, well, why is it Jackson, Birth of the Group of Seven, and then the Great War? Why not Jackson, the Great War, and then the Birth of the Group of Seven? Because the Group of Seven first shows in 1920, the Great War was 1914, 1918. And as I had to remind him that actually the group really came together before the war. That was really the point of the narrative. By 1913, the main members had all met, and they really could have had a group of something show in 1915, 1916 if this war hadn't come along. So that's how the narrative ended up being organized, and so why this book as well? Because not to dump on the Group of Seven, but if you talk to anybody in Canada who knows a little bit about art, or maybe doesn't know anything about art, and you ask them, what do you know about Canadian art? They go, oh, the Group of Seven. Like, that's kind of been our hyper focus of, our starter kit set, 1920 to about 1932. That's the stuff that matters. And even when we're doing that stuff, we tend to treat the lead up as kind of a preamble. This is kind of, some things happened in their lives, and then they got together, and wonderful things happened in Canadian painting. But Jackson was really interesting to me because of all the members and associates of the group, including Thompson, he was better trained. He had more experience. He was really a more accomplished artist than any of the other ones that came together. But before the war started, he was going to turn 38 when the first exhibition happened in 1920. So that's not old for an artist, but he's got a few years under his belt. And really by 1910, he's going to be what you might call a painter's painter. He's kind of figured out, I'll go through the slides and show you, but he's getting to the point of, he's got impressionistic naturalism or naturalistic impressionism pretty well nailed. And then it's a matter of what am I going to do next with my career and my life. So the show you've walked through goes from about 1911 to 1920. So I'm going to backfill some Jackson for you that's not in the show. So Jackson was born in Montreal in 1882. This is the house he lived in Hallowell Avenue from about 1905-06 on, where his mother and family lived. You can tell I was there at Halloween because there's pumpkins and I think there's a ghost in the picture somewhere. It's right across from Westmount Secondary School. It was the Montreal Athletic Association grounds. So Jackson was one of 6 kids, and when he was 9 years old, he came home from school, and he found these 2 strange men going through the house with ledgers, writing everything down in them, and his mother was there sobbing, and no one knew where his dad was. His dad had left. He'd gone to Chicago. He abandoned his family, and Jackson, at the age of 12, had to go to work and to support his mother, as the other children did. And as he had an older brother, Harry, who was a good commercial artist, a really good commercial artist, and he followed Harry into the lithography and drawing business. He took night classes at the Montreal Council of Arts and Manufacturers. You could learn plumbing there, you could learn all kinds of skills there, and they were free. So he did these night classes to learn, basically, yeah, there was a little bit of instruction on drawing and painting, but mainly it was learning how to do catalog illustrations of mattresses and boots and stuff like that. So you could, do catalogs and advertising in newspapers. And so that's the trade he went into. That's how he supported himself. But he decided he was going to be an artist. He wanted to be a painter. whereas Harry, who might have been as good as or better a talent, Harry became a very good commercial artist. And the two stayed close to their life, but it was AY that decided he was going to go down this road, however difficult it was going to be. So let's go to the next. So I wanted to show a couple of these, just so I've talked to a few arts groups, and I like to show these paintings because this is really early Jackson. This is like he's 21, so he was starting in watercolors. And he was a competent watercolorist at this point. And then if you go to the next one, 1905, this is early spring Hemiford. He's really getting, his skills are really progressing a lot. But he hadn't really painted in oils. And if we go to oils, this is like Covered Bridge, in the Eastern Tundras. It's really not very good. And I always like to show artists this because, these people like Jackson don't spring like out of a godhead perfect, They have to learn a craft. So I like to show the crap, as I call it. We really do. If you want to understand as an historian the progress of an artist, you want to see what they went through and what they overcame and where they got their skills. So Jackson is about to go to Paris to study at this point, and he's going to study at the Académie Julian, which is like 10 minutes a week of instruction, but all the Canadians went there. And it's really more the experience of the fellow artists, the ferment of idea and, all working together towards, some kind of goal. And I think we can go to the next one. So by 1910, after the period in France, he comes home, and this is a painting he makes that if you're, next time you're at the National Gallery, make a point of seeing. This is Edge of the Maple Wood, and this is the painting that really put him on the map. It was shown in England in 1910 to very good notices. The first time Jackson showed at the Ontario Art Association in spring of 1911, he entered this painting. The British reviews talked about crisp, clear Canadian light, which was interesting to read because that became a rallying cry of what the Group of Seven was going to do. None of this muggy European, haze and stuff like that. It's going to be this bright, crisp, presentation of the landscape. And this is doubly important because he sold this painting. He hardly ever sold paintings in the first part of his career. In fact, he burned a lot of his paintings. We have very little. It's what's nice about the exhibition, too, is because there's just very little left from before First World War, because he just tossed things in a furnace and moved on. But this one he sold, and he sold it to a young artist named Lauren Harris, who had seen it in 1911 in Toronto, and he remembered it. And Jackson had been invited. He'd been in Europe, which we'll get back to. He'd been on another 2-year trip. He'd come back, and he was invited. He hadn't met them yet, but J.H. MacDonald and Harris invited him to put some paintings in a little pictures exhibition in Toronto. Everything had to be 30 inches by 30, no bigger. And Jackson entered a bunch of stuff from his European trip, and to his amazement, he sold most of them. And he'd hardly ever sold anything in Montreal. The collecting class in Montreal was obsessed with 19th century Barbizon, French paintings and the Hague School of the Dutch. Jackson would memorably talk about the houses were bulging with pictures of cows and windmills. And they were really second-rate stuff. And one of the great proponents of this collecting class, he, as Jackson described, his advice to collectors was, the painting is not ready until the artist ferments. So, you didn't buy from living artists, you didn't support living artists, you hung the stuff on your wall that dealers came home from Europe on their, annual trips and showed you the wares, and then you put them in a nice frame with a spotlight, and isn't this lovely? I've got my latest Dutch painting. So he sold a bunch of paintings. He couldn't believe he sold these paintings, and he sold, the one he sold was to Lauren Harris, this one. And that started the conversation with Harris about where does Canadian art go next. And what's really interesting is that these two guys had not even met yet physically, and they were working out basically what the Group of Seven was going to do. Let's go to the next slide because I'm trying to remember what I did next. So we're going to go back a little bit to explain Group of Seven, we think of Group of Seven being, classically, if you think of A.J. Casson and others, and Jackson, you think of, we live on Georgian Bay, so it's like rock and pine and the wind and wind-blown water and waves. It's, that's the iconic image of Canada that the group created. Jackson had no idea what Georgian Bay was at this time in his life, but he had family in what was then Berlin, Ontario, now Kitchener, and they were the sisters of his dad who had taken off, and they were fairly well-to-do, and his mother had the bright idea, well, I'm going to send Alec to Berlin, and he's going to meet some patrons or something. I don't know what the plan exactly was, but somebody will spend money on Alec. And nobody spent money on Alec. He said they had no taste in painting. There was nothing worth mentioning. It was all pearl soap, illustrations on their walls. But he met the Clement family, which was who he was related to, and they were another wealthy branch. There was a judge, and the father was a judge. And anyway, they had a cottage. They had a cottage up on Georgian Bay, and they were going up for the summer to open it up. And at a place called Portage Point. The cottage itself is not there anymore, but there's a cottage on that site. And so he went to Portage Point. And let's just flip to the next slide. Let's remember what it is. So if you know anything about Georgian Bay, that's Portage Point. It's just north of, this whole area called the Cognachine is just north of Beausoleil Island, Georgian Bay Islands National Park. So we'll flip again. So, he was hanging out. This is pictures from the period, rowing around, having sailing adventures and stuff like that. But if we flip to the next, I think, this is actually, we were there last week. This is Honeymoon Bay, and up in the upper right, the cottage is actually back in there on the mainland, or not the mainland, but on Portage Point, backing onto the mainland. So this gets you an idea of the landscape that Jackson was experiencing for the first time, which he had never seen before, never been in. So let's flip, see what we got. So he writes this letter home, which is an amazing letter. I don't think I have to tell you it's amazing, and I can read it if you can't see it. He writes to his mother, "I get tired of messing around by myself. Today I chopped wood nearly all day for want of something better to do. Sketching simply won't go. Sorry to say I have done very little sketching. The country does not lend itself to it. It's a great country to have a holiday in, but it's nothing but little islands covered with scrub and pine trees, and it's not quite paintable." So here is a foundational figure in the Group of Seven seeing the iconic landscape of the Group of Seven, and he just can't figure out what to do with it at all. Has no clue. He has no response to it. It's just not worth his time. It's not worth the paint. He does do a bit of painting at the time, but if we flip to the next. So I wanted to make you appreciate that what he was used to looking at the time was from his last trip to Europe. He was painting in Venice. He was painting in Assisi. He was painting landscapes of Europe, agrarian and in these old towns and Saint-Malo waterfront and stuff like that. So this is one of them. This is one of the paintings he sold at the Little Pictures exhibition. Now I'm going to do my great aside here, and they've already heard this, and I'm delighted they're here. When I was working on this book, I realized, there's a mention in his aunt's diary of going to the Little Pictures and having lunch at Eaton's with Jack Beck. And I knew that Jack Beck bought a painting. He bought a painting of Venice. And Jackson has this massively complicated family tree. I drew it on a big piece of drawing paper, and I needed both sides. And so there's a Beck family over on the Berlin-Kitchener side, this like Seradenbeck and hydroelectricity and all that stuff. Very big name, popular, well known in Ontario politics. And then there was this other Beck family that was in Leeds, around Leeds in England, and they had nothing to do with the Becks in Kitchener who came from Germany. And I was just racking my brains to figure out who Jackson Beck was. I'll keep it short, but basically I finally figured out, this is a different Becks, totally different. He's an architect. He's come to Toronto about 1905. And he comes in, he had been to Venice as a student, and this was kind of an ex post facto, memorabilia from his own trip because A. White painted there, so he bought the painting. So one of the great terrors when you write a book, it doesn't matter how much research you do or how long you spend researching it, you put it out and then you wait for the emails and the phone, and the letters from people that you have never heard of before, who tell you, oh well, I have this and I have that, and I wish I'd been able to talk to you, kind of thing. So I got this email from Sue Nelson, and Sue Nelson was reading the book, and she basically said, oh, Jackson Beck is my grandfather. That painting, it's in my sister's house. Nobody's seen it for a century. Yeah, I curled with your mom and dad at the Dundas Curling Club. So, and at the time my dad was still alive, and so I just had this picture of me banging my head on a desk, and my dad's out curling with the people who, who have the painting. So delighted. This painting is in the exhibition. I'm really pleased that they've allowed it to be here. And also, I think we'll go to the next slide. These are some of his Assisi paintings, and this is also Assisi 1912, the lower right. That's also from the family collection, one of AOI's paintings. Fountain Assisi is in the Art Gallery of Hamilton. Assisi 1912, that has a great story because it belonged to the AGO, and the AGO, while I was writing the book, did a DX session. And they got rid of a bunch of AY Jacksons, 20 of them. Almost all of them were like Alberta post-war, 1950s. And Jackson, they have like 500 AY Jacksons. So I could they wanted to diversify the collection. But in that package of stuff they got rid of Assisi 1912. And that was kind of a message to me, this is why you're doing the book, because you don't understand why are these paintings important? Because when Jackson came back, as I said, I've given you sort of the meet Lauren Harris type stuff. He and Randolph Houghton, a fellow fellow Montreal artist, had done a joint exhibition in Montreal. It went fairly well for them, and then they entered paintings in the Art Association of Montreal Spring Exhibition. Pretty much the same set of paintings. It was just part of the association thing. And in the fall of 1912, the annual Armory exhibition in New York had happened, and it was what is considered the introduction of the modern to the public in New York. And in America. It was all the futurism, the nude descending, a staircase by Marcel Duchamp. It was all this isms of post-impressionism, and critics just completely lost their minds. It wasn't just the end of art, it was the end of Western civilization, this stuff. And that notoriety and fear and panic spilled over into Canada, so the Spring Association, show opens in the spring of 1913, and the critics just take on Houghton, take on Jackson. The best thing anybody said about Jackson was that he takes post-impressionism to the point of, he doesn't cross over into insanity. He sort of holds himself back a bit. But the two of them really experienced the whitest heat of criticism of that spring show. And these Assisi paintings were really a moment in Canadian art. This was Canada seeing stuff that actually wasn't that radical. One of the ironic things about Jackson at the time is that when he came home from Europe, he had tried to enter paintings in the big Paris exhibition of the fall, and his stuff was rejected. And as he wrote, I think it was to his mother, said, "My stuff is too tame. I can't get on the wall there." So he's too tame for Europe, and he comes home, and he's the devil incarnate, when he puts stuff up, in Canada, which tells you a bit about the lag of taste, in Canadian art. Let's go to the next one. So here's Assisi from the Plain, which is also here. So this is the landscape that Jackson was seeing. This is what he'd been painting for about 2 years in Europe. So, they're lovely paintings. They're very loose. There's a great letter and you should look at the paintings, because there's a letter to a cousin, Charles Clement, where Jackson's talking about how you should paint, because Clement was taking it up as a hobby. And he does talk about, use the biggest brushes you can handle. And so you'll see a lot of big flat brushes in those, in the paint that's being slopped around, in that period. So this is what he was painting, but he didn't know anything about the north of Canada. He was painting either in the eastern townships or, he was painting in Europe. So let's go next. So this is what he was starting to do in that spring when everything was going to hell in Montreal with his reputation, but he's writing with Lauren Harris back and forth as to what they're going to do. So again, you're starting to see these big fat brushes come in. This is much less detailed than something like Edge of the Maple Wood. Really, he could have hung this in a Group of 7 show. And in fact, there's another painting he did in that spring called Cedar Swamp, which I think is in the National Gallery. It's in the book. I have it reproduced. And it's so predictive of what the Group of Seven is going to be that Jackson actually puts it in a Group of Seven show in Vancouver in 1921. It's 8 years later. He hasn't even met these people yet. They haven't worked together. But it's almost like Jackson by himself, although he's with Randolph Houghton, who weirdly has never anything to do with this group. He shows as a guest, but he never is part of this movement. But writing letters back and forth with Lauren Harris and throwing paint around, in the eastern townships, Jackson kind of works out what they're going to do. And it's really important that he works out what they're going to do at that point, because he's about to go to Toronto and he's going to meet Tom Thompson, who's just kind of come on the scene in late 1913 when he meets him. He's going to meet Arthur Lismer, he's going to meet Varley. All these people are going to meet for the first time, and there's this talent, Jackson, who's going to drop in from Montreal, who through some letters has worked out basically what the Group of Seven is going to do. It's kind of settled almost before the war has even started. So this is Night. I'm still trying to figure out what island this is. It's somewhere near the Cognoscine. So this is one of his paintings where he started to figure out what to do with the North, and he showed this to pretty good notices in Montreal in 1913. It's now called Night, Georgian Bay. He called it Land of the Leading Pine, and one of his art friends wrote him and said the title sent him to bed for a week. So I think he changed it after that. But this is after the 3 years. He's been away. He's come back. He's visited the Cognoscine again. Now he's starting to figure out what to do with the rocks and the pine and the atmosphere. So in the fall of 1914, after he's been out west painting, he goes to Algonquin Park, and this is a very iconic photo of the gathering of minds. So you have Tom Thompson in the back left. Jackson had met him in the fall of 1913. They shared a studio together. There's Frederick Varley in the foreground, who had just decided to sort of throw his hand in with these people. Arthur Lismer is there with his wife and daughter. This is the one and only time they're going to be all together at the same time working in the North. Thompson, of course, is going to, notoriously drown in 1917 in Canoe Lake. They're just not ever going to work together. And this is the only time. And the war is on by this point. It started in early August. And Jackson, in his letters, talks about he really thought this is going to be over in a couple months. It's nothing. Once the British Army gets over there, this is just going to pass. Thompson was talking about, no, this is going on for 3-4 years, and he was very cynical about the war. And so was Jackson. Jackson didn't really think much of authority and the militia and whatnot. But let's click on, see what I do next. Okay, in that fall, I wanted to show this too, from that period. One of the paintings he makes is Red Maple, which he shows that autumn to pretty good notices. It's in the National Gallery. Jackson wrote a lot. Jackson was very hard on his own work. I think I mentioned he burned a lot of stuff. There's also a great letter to him to the National Gallery in the 1930s where he's reviewing, and then they started buying his stuff by 1910-11. Even though he had no clientele, he was selling to the National Gallery. But he writes a letter. Basically, he wants to swap some paintings. He wants to give the stuff he likes and take back the stuff he doesn't like that they'd already bought. So, one of the paintings he calls Cheese. This one, Red Maple, he calls Passable. And he wanted it back, but they kept it. But the sketch on the left, which is in the show, is in the McMichael collection. That's the sketch he based it on. And Jackson would talk about, he would look at sometimes the paintings when people did the sketches, and then the idea was you did a sketch in the woods, your plein air stuff, but then you went back to the studio and you made something bigger and grander out of it. And sometimes he would say the ginger went out of it. Like, you just lost something in translation. And I think Red Maple did kind of lose something in translation. I think sketch for Red Maple is a much more vigorous painting. There's also a Thompson painting of, this is probably I think this is the Oxtongue River. And he has red maples in the sort of the same scene, but the red maples are on the other bank, and the river is flowing the other way. So I really have this image of the two men on that trip together. Thompson is on that side of the river, Jackson's on this side of the river, and they're painting crossways at each other, the exact same scene. And if we could somehow loop it, we'd see Thompson in the background of this one. And if you looked at Thompson's and looped it, you could, there's AY. He's in the woods there. He's painting back the other way. So, and then the only thing I'd note about Red Maple is because the Red Maple was the shoulder patch of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in most of the regiments. I think there was It was shown in a patriotic exhibition to raise funds for already, what they were anticipating to be widows and orphans of soldiers. So there was a resonance of using a red maple at that time and showing it because of the war effort. So we're going to go to Jackson in war. Jackson was the only member of the group that served in the forces overseas as a volunteer. Randolph Houghton, his good painting friend, he enlisted almost immediately. He felt a lot of pressure from Houghton to sign up. His younger brother also signed up, and his younger brother was at 2nd Ypres in April 1915. And 2nd Ypres was the first time Canadian troops were in combat there. It was the first time the Germans used flamethrowers. It was the first time the Germans used chlorine gas. It was an absolute massacre. The home papers in Montreal, when you read them from April 1915, are just lists and lists of casualties. Every day there's just more bodies and it cleans out the elite ranks of Montreal's Golden Square Mile. All the officer class people from these great families were like their sons and inheritors were dropping, dead at Ypres because of this battle. And he was in Montreal and feeling enormously guilty, and he would say that I couldn't live with myself anymore. And his brother was at 2nd Ypres. So in June of 1915, he joins a new battalion there called the 60th Infantry Battalion. He signs in right at the bottom as a private, and he goes overseas, and they go into action around March, April of 1916 on the Ypres salient. And there's some wonderful, wonderful letters back and forth from Jackson home about his experiences. He spends a lot of time at signal stations, a little back from the line. But what you get from Jackson, apart from his cynicism about command, he loves the Canadian Army, the men in the Army. He believes in the war. But he realizes that survival has nothing to do with heroism or individual skill or how good a shooter you are. It's completely random. This is a mechanized war. He writes this great letter home. As they're marching to the front, he tells his mother that it's like approaching a steelworks, just the sounds and the explosions and the lights. And yeah, he realizes this is like I can be killed 2 miles back from the front, sitting in a signal station because of German shelling, or I can be killed 50 yards from them in the trenches in the front when we get rotated in. It was completely capricious whether you would survive or die. And he is caught up in the larger battle called Montreal, June 3rd to 13th, when the Germans launched a massive offensive on the salient. They had all of the high ground except one little area, and they just overran so many of the Canadian positions. And he was in a completely chaotic, push to the front. Men were being killed by shrapnel literally right next to him, and he was standing there unscathed. We'll just wait back for a bit on it. Yeah. And he ended up being hit by shrapnel. And he goes to a casualty clearing station, and he goes to the hospitals at Étaples, which was where the artist colony was before the war, where he painted for years when he was in Europe. And now it was this giant military medical station where they did these x-rays. He thought he'd been hit by this piece of shrapnel on the left. It went into his hip. They did x-rays and found this entire shrapnel ball 3 inches down in his shoulder, which they had to dig out of him. He kept these things as souvenirs and mailed them to his mother. And they're actually in storage here at McMichael. And the fact that he didn't even know he'd been hit there speaks to the shock. There's no question when you read his medical records that he suffered from shell shock. He was terrified of going back to the line. He didn't think he could survive if they sent him back. He was, when you read his records, you realize he wasn't quite sick enough to send home, which a lot of men were, because you couldn't do anything with them anymore. And he wasn't quite well enough to send back to the front. So he was knocking around camps in England, like sorting mail and stuff like that. And he'd have a medical board review every month just to decide what to do with you. And every one of those reviews was, if I pass the review, I'm going back to the front. And he didn't think. He was probably right. He wasn't gonna live if he went back a second time. So we're gonna go to war art, but we'll keep this up for a second because this is actually this is a painting of the Princess Pat's the day that Jackson is wounded in the same basic area. and we'll keep this as a reference to war art, because Jackson gets a huge break in the summer of 1917, because Lord Beaverbrook, who's a big guy with the Canadian government, propaganda for Britain, he decides he's going to create a war memorials project for Canada. It's going to be self-funded, and initially Beaverbrook, who despite the fact there's a Beaverbrook gallery today, Beaverbrook knew absolutely zero about art. He didn't start collecting art till after the Second World War. So he was relying on British art experts to tell him, oh, we need artists to go to the front to paint, who do we get? So he was hiring these British artists. And they'd get an honorary major's rank, and off they would be sent to capture something. And, that got sort of, the hair on the necks of some Canadians up a bit, and he was informed, there are some Canadians that paint. They can do this stuff. And by the way, I'm really crushing the story down here, but by the way, there's one of them in a camp right now. It's A.Y. Jackson. So he goes in, he gets interviewed by Beaverbrook, and Beaverbrook brings him in. And he gives him an honorary lieutenancy. Everybody else gets a major, he gets a lieutenancy. And he's sent off to paint. And so Jackson immediately, you're realizing you're dealing with a man who's been through deep trauma as a soldier. Most of these other painters had not served in the army. And he has to figure out, what am I painting? Why am I painting this? What am I going to show about a war? The whole question of what is war art even for is on most everyone's mind. And what Jackson does say, in hindsight, right after the war, he said he didn't want to do what he called the cook-ups, which is like these kind of paintings. This was done by a young Canadian artist, Kenneth Forbes, who did serve in the military and was gassed, and he was asked to paint this. But Forbes wasn't there. You got to get some models, you pose them, you kind of imagine what the scene was going to be. There was nothing authentic about these to Jackson. He talks about, I don't know which painting he's probably talking about, but he talks about, if you look at them really closely, you can see, oh, there's that guy there, and then, oh, he's over here too, and then, oh, he's up over there, because he's using the same model, I don't know how many times to fill in his crowd. So he didn't want to do the cook-ups. He didn't want to do these reimagined battle scenes. He didn't want to confront and depict the literally visceral horror of the war. He just couldn't do it. He had this idea, I want to show what it's like to be in the trenches, but he couldn't show the reality of that. He wasn't going to do what Varley did. Varley, as a war artist, went over in 1918, and he produces a very famous work called For What? And it's basically a cart of mangled body parts being buried in the rain. Jackson admired what Varley did, but he was never capable of doing that. So Jackson had to figure out, what am I going to show? Why am I showing this stuff? And he was also worried if he didn't get the stuff they wanted, unlike all these other artists, he was just going to be sent right back to the army. So it was almost a life and death thing for him that he had to figure out this assignment. So if we go to the next now. So he did a lot of sketching, and these sketches are in the show right now. He would work in pencil and crayon and colored pencil sometimes, trying to capture what the landscape is like. The first time he went was in the fall of 1917. He gets sent to Passchendaele. Passchendaele was a bloody, muddy disaster, 60,000 casualties. He couldn't get anywhere near the front to paint because, weirdly enough, there was a war on, so you just can't stand there with an easel and do your plein air sketches. So he did a lot of stuff behind the lines, basically, and a lot of kind of agrarian scenes and villages and things that really weren't particularly warlike, and they did really worry him when he went home I went back to London, is this what they want? Is this what I'm going to, am I going to be allowed to do more, or am I going to go back into battle? So the one good painting that did come out of that trip, and it's in this exhibition, is Houses of Ypres, and it's based on a sketch he did on the very last day he was there, and it's very faithful to the sketch. And this is another aspect of what he had to learn to deal with, because we're coming out of a period of Impressionism and the kind of work he was doing where, at least you were doing an oil sketch. You would go out into sometimes Jackson worked right on the easel where he was working, but often it was this oil sketch, and then you took it to the studio. But he couldn't do oil sketches. He did very few of them when he was a war artist. It just really wasn't safe to stand there in an easel and try to paint a war. So he did these very hurried sketches, and then he would have to go back to the studio in London and create a painting out of it, which is a completely different way of working. He'd never done that before. So if you look really closely at some of those drawings, you'll see these little pencil, like little annotations, and he's writing in the colors. He's writing in reminders to himself of what the atmosphere is like, or green, whatever, blue here, gray. Like, he just had to recreate stuff as he got back into his studio. So Houses of Ypres was really, I think, his one real success out of 1917. So we'll go to the next. He gets to go back. He gets to go back in March of 1918, and he goes to a different area of the front, down around Hill 70 and Levan, a couple other towns. And he goes to a landscape that's been already fought over, and there are literally miles of absolutely nothing. Like, it's been recaptured from the Germans, and it's a vast, vast empty wasteland. And he had mild criticism after the war. People would say, well, where are the people? Like, you're painting a war, and where are the soldiers? Like, I don't see, like, he does not doing the action things. And he said, and you do see these figures sometimes trudging through the middle ground sometimes, but he said you could look at this landscape for miles and see not a single person. And what Jackson, I think, realized, and he did brilliantly, and also keep in mind, these paintings that are here, they're in storage at the War Museum, because there was no place to hang them when they came back. The idea was to build a museum of the war art, and Canada had other things to spend money on in 1919. So most of this work is in a very well organized set of storage racks in the basement of the Canadian War Museum. That's where I saw them, just pulling these racks back, and you realize, like, Jackson did about 39 paintings, and most of them are, on these racks. So we don't get to see these things. They do bring them out for special exhibitions, or it goes to the Juno Center, but some of Jackson's finest work is basically hidden away. So it's a real treat. I think people will be able to see it here. But when you look at the paintings that Jackson did in that, coming out of his trip in March 1918 and the stuff he produced in the studio when he got back, Jackson figured out, I'm going to make people understand the war by showing them the effects of the war on the landscape. If I can convey that, this industrialized, destructive thing, you'll appreciate the experience the soldier had. This is what we were walking through, and this is what we were experiencing. And so most of his paintings from this period, he uses this very sort of high view. The horizon is very high in these paintings. And over again, what you find is the war, which he shows you in the middle ground, the foreground and the middle ground, is what the war has done. It's the background where the war is going on still, because it literally is still going on when he's there. He can't get any closer than that, really. So it's still churning away, still destroying. And his paintings have this fascinating melding of weather and artillery. You're never really sure what exactly you're looking at. This, to me, looks like a Georgian Bay thunderstorm, but it's really, the battle going on just a few miles away. So he has this ambiguous, message about, in his backgrounds. Also, you really appreciate looking at these paintings, what a great colorist he was. He had a really big influence on Tom Thompson. We know that. Lismer had it as well. But Jackson could pull color out of mud like nobody had a right to, we could expect to. If we go to the next one, I think. Yeah, back one. Yeah, I mean, this is a great example. I mean, an incredible palette that he's applied to what is basically a brown landscape. Again, everything in the foreground and middle ground has been completely destroyed. He has put some figures. And in the background, we've got this kind of stormy thing going on. And a lot of it is probably artillery, because he was actually attached to an artillery regiment at the time. But we're still also looking at something that feels like, it looks like the big cumulus clouds that he was painting that were rolling in over off Georgian Bay. So we'll go to the next. So Gas Attack Leavin is another one in the show. And this one speaks to the very peculiar, unsettling experience of war, in which war was an aesthetic experience that other artists talked about as well. It was something beautiful to look at, even though you knew how destructive it was and what horrors were going on. So for this painting, he did a pencil sketch with a lot of little notes about the colors and the flares, which ones to put in where. And it was a British gas attack on the German lines. So you can imagine it's a pretty horrible thing going on. But he's standing on this ridge with a British artist watching it, and it's like they're watching Victoria Day fireworks. It's just an amazing thing to see and experience. And he's not the only one that goes through that disquieting thing, that this is a lovely war in some very strange ways. So we'll go next. So Jackson comes home. He comes home and he's discharged in 1919, and he hooks up with the fellows he had known before the war. Thompson has died, but he knows Lismer and he knows Harris and J.H. MacDonald, and there's, they just decide they need to move forward. J.H. MacDonald calls Jackson the general. He's the guy that's going to get everything organized and execute the battle plans. They actually use that language in the letters. They're going to have this group show, and I think it's probably because of Harris and his theosophy. He had this mystical idea about the number 7, so they needed 7 people, and they didn't have Thompson anymore. And so they added Frank Carmichael, and they added Franz Johnson, even though Jackson, in a letter after that show, said, I don't know what Carmichael and Johnson are doing in this show. They just, their stuff doesn't match what the rest of us doing. Carmichael stayed on with them. Johnson moved to Winnipeg to teach art. But Jackson goes off to Georgian Bay, and in the spring of 1919, again, in the Cognoscene, and he paints this painting, March Storm, Georgian Bay. And as I'll say with the next painting, he's really still painting war paintings. I mean, this is a really unpleasant, violent place. This is not the Georgian Bay of Cassin and others, and as I've said, the bright sun and the wind-whipped water, and isn't it a lovely, look at all the lovely rock and pine. This is snow squalls, these dirty tendrils coming across the bay. You don't want to be there. It's not a place you want to be involved in. But he paints this along with some other paintings at Freddie's channel and puts them in the first show. We'll go to the next. And this is another painting he puts in that show. And we have First Snow Algoma here. It's in the Michael collection, and if you walked through, you saw it. And God bless the staff here. They tracked down the sketch for it. It was in the faculty club at the University of Toronto. So he had been to Algoma with Lauren Harris and others. Harris set up a railway car with all the fineries of home, and they would just park it at the siding, on Lake Superior, and off they'd go and sketch. So he sketched, this painting, which became First Snow. Now, if you look at the two paintings, right away you'll see, well, there's no snow. There's no snow blowing around. Yeah, there's some dead trees, but they're not really dead, burned trees. The sky is not as menacing as it became, and First Snow Algoma is really, it's another war painting. If you look at the painting that's there of A Cop's Evening, which is the landscape in which he was wounded, it's those broken, burned out, stunted trees that have been sheared away by shelling, and he's creating a painting that's ambiguous about, I don't know if I'm looking at ash and smoke, or I don't know if I'm looking at snow and flurries, and for me, I think this ranks as one of Jackson's signature paintings. It melds the experience of war with what he's going to do in the Group of 7. And Jackson, as an artist, he's peculiar in that despite his literally hundreds and hundreds of paintings, almost too many paintings, he doesn't have a signature painting. It's not like Thompson, it's the West Wind, or Jack Pine or something. Jackson just produces a lot of paintings, but I think First Snow Algoma really does deserve to be a signature painting for him. And the war for Jackson through this painting and stuff he does later, it just never really goes away. And in fact, in that show, some of his fellow artists showed war paintings because Varley had gone over and painted. So the first Group of 7 show included literal war art that they had done to round out what was on the walls. And I think Jackson had done his best stuff by probably 1922, 1923. It's not like he painted bad things necessarily in the 20s, 30s. He started producing way too much stuff after the war. A lot of stuff was destroyed deliberately because it was not going to do much for his legacy. And he'd worked out what he was going to do. It's that dynamic, interesting process of up into 1910 and then through that pre-war period, and then him trying to wrestle with what am I doing with this subject? How am I going to approach it? How am I going to deal with the realities of what I can and cannot do in the field? And then how do I turn it into a painting in the studio? That's where Jackson sorts out a lot of what he's going to do as an artist. He doesn't really change a lot after that. It's that 1910, 1920 where you're really watching a pretty adventurous artist for Canada, working on the edge of the, out on the front edge of the modern, determine what landscape painting is going to look like, in this country.